Last week we began in the New Testament by looking at the book of Mark. There are 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we began looking at Matthew last week. While Matthew, we said last week, wrote for a primarily Jewish audience and emphasized Jewish traditions, Mark focused on a Roman audience and highlighted mostly Jesus' great compassion and humility because he wants to show Jesus as a man. More than any other gospel, Mark throws the spotlight on how much Jesus suffered. It is the shortest of the 4 gospels, and yet nearly half of it covers the last 8 days of Jesus' life. So that's how focused Mark is on that final week of Jesus' life. The Romans were very active people. They were a type A culture, as much us, if not worse. So Mark portrays Jesus as a man on the move, a man of action. It moves quickly. Jesus is in a whirlwind of activity throughout Mark's gospel, yet always revolved around a calm and peaceful center in his life. Mark has been called the on-the-go gospel. If you are a cut-to-the-chase, bottom-line type of person, Mark's gospel is the one for you. Now, Jesus called a variety of men from different walks of life to be his first disciples. And he began with fishermen to whom he offered a unique challenge. And I must say this too, I should have said this in the absolute beginning. I am not covering any same story twice in the Gospels. The way I've chosen to deal with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is each week I will not cover a story that has already been covered before. So there'll be unique and new stories to us in each of the Gospels, as this one is. So one day as Jesus was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. And he called out to them, "Come, follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people." And they left their nets at once and followed him. The urgency of their response says one of 2 things. They absolutely hated their job. Worse than anybody has ever hated a job in all of history. Or it says something about Jesus' charisma and his power of persuasion. I think it's more likely that. And they didn't get very far, because just a little farther up the shore, Jesus saw Zebedee's sons, James and John, in a boat repairing their nets. He called them at once, and they also followed him, leaving their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men. So, what we have here is 4 of the disciples already called. Afterward, Jesus went up on a mountain and called out the ones he wanted to go with him, and they came to him. And he appointed 12 of them and called them his apostles. They were to accompany him, and he would send them out to preach, giving them authority to cast out demons. And what a cast of character they were going to be. In the next screen, you'll see who they all are, but there's a reason I'm not showing you that yet. What a cast of characters were put under one roof. You talk about diversity. These men were all over the social spectrum. Let's just take 2 of them. Matthew, the tax collector, and Simon, the zealot. Okay, Matthew, the tax collector, was a Roman collaborator. He collected Jewish taxes for the Romans and turned it back over to them. Simon was a Jewish patriot, a zealot. That's not a reference to his nationality. It means zealous. He was a political radical who absolutely hated the Romans. And Jews helped them, the zealots, because they hated the Romans too. In fact, the zealots were known as the dagger men, which referred to the knife that men like Simon carried under their cloak and used on Roman sympathizers, men like Matthew. I tried to think about how to compare Matthew and Simon in today's world. I started to say it's like a far right-wing Republican and a far left-wing Democrat, but it's really worse than that. It really is worse than that. So I don't know how really you could compare it any further than that. Yet Jesus amazingly reconciled these two men. Now, we've named 4 of the disciples. It's a great story about a teacher of an adult Sunday school class who asked his class to name the 12 original disciples. And all out through the class they thought, well, that's easy. Peter, James, John. And then there was a little drop off. And then with some hesitation, let's see, there's Andrew, there's Thomas, there's Judas, and that's half of them. And then there's a whole lot of hesitation. And then someone said, I think Philip. And that was it. Nobody could name the others. And I'll tell you that class where that happened. It was right down the hall over here where I was teaching one Sunday, a group of young adults. That's where that class happened. Some mistakenly then named Luke. Others mistakenly named Mark. But the average Christian probably cannot name more than 5 or 6 of these 12 that he chose. Simon, James, and John, the sons of Zebedee, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, Judas Iscariot. And these 12 men, or 11 of them, would turn the world upside down in the first century with the gospel of Jesus Christ. I think since we're looking at the disciples who became apostles in Mark, the first 3 chapters, Mark would be a good point to talk about the difference between an apostle and a disciple. Each of these 12 became apostles in the early church, with Judas being the obvious exception. So let's define the difference between an apostle and a disciple. A disciple, the word literally means a learner who seeks to imitate his teacher. And in the Gospels, the 12 were still called disciples because Jesus was still with them and was still teaching them all the way up unto his ascension into heaven. Later, after the church begins in Acts chapter 2, their designation is going to become apostles. But there were still other disciples. In fact, throughout the Gospels, at least 72 other disciples were identified at one time. An apostle, on the other hand, was one sent forth with a special commission as an authorized representative of the sender. And you had to have certain qualifications to be an apostle. And one of the reasons we know that is because when Judas hanged himself and was to be replaced in Acts chapter 1, they said, here are some of the qualifications that who we replace Judas with must have. It turned out to be Matthias. Now, he had numerous disciples, at least 72, whom he sent out on one occasion. And so those 72, presumably, were all in the election of the new apostle in Acts chapter 1. But there were several qualifications that made the office of an apostle unique and distinguished them from other disciples. First of all but one were chosen directly by the Lord. They accompanied Jesus. They had to have accompanied Jesus from the beginning of his ministry. So that means Matthias and anyone else had to have been here with Jesus from the beginning of his ministry. When Peter called for a successor to Judas in Acts chapter 1, he said, and I quote, "It must come from men who have been with us the whole time the Lord went in and out among us, beginning from John's baptism." That's what he said. they also had to be, according to Acts 1:22, eyewitnesses of the resurrection. They were the primary leaders of the first century church, and apostolic approval was sought for every single major decision that was made, or major move that was made in the early church. And they had the power. They had the power to also work miracles for the purpose of authenticating the message of Jesus and the Word. So there's your difference between disciples and apostles. In chapter 2, the action begins when several friends of a paralyzed man bring him to Jesus, but the house in which Jesus was speaking was so crowded that they couldn't get him to Jesus. And not easily discouraged, 4 of the men took him up on top of the house, dug a hole in the roof, and began lowering their buddy through the roof. If I'd have been the paralyzed guy, I'd have been tickled that somebody loved me that much and was willing to take that chance for me. But I got to be honest with you, I don't know if I'd have been one of those 4. I just don't know if I'd have been willing to cut through somebody else's roof. I'm not sure. That's being quite forward. And not easily discouraged, they did this though, and they weren't thinking of themselves. They didn't need a special blessing from the Lord themselves, but they had a friend who did, and they were willing to go to pretty extreme measures to get him to Jesus. You know, somebody has said, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Jesus actually realized how much these people cared about their friend too, right? He certainly did. You know, the Lord's work has always been accomplished by talented people or intelligent people or strong people, but mostly it's been accomplished by people of faith, whether they were talented, intelligent, strong, or not. It has been accomplished by people who believe in the miraculous power of God. There's a poem I've always liked that said, there are thousands to tell you it cannot be done. There are thousands to prophesy failure. There are thousands to point out to you one by one the dangers that await to assail you. But just buckle in with a bit of a grin. Just take off your coat and go to it. Just start to sing as you tackle the thing that cannot be done, and you'll do it. And that's exactly what these 4 men were doing. They were not going to take no for an answer. They had one shot to get their friend healed and fixed, and they would go to extreme measures to get it done. And so because they did that, the text says, seeing their faith. Whose faith? Not the man, not the paralyzed man. Seeing the 4 friends' faith, Jesus said to the paralyzed man, my child, your sins are forgiven. And it got him in some big trouble over time, as the Pharisees and scribes and teachers of the law began to say, who is this man that he thinks he can forgive sin as well as heal people? And Jesus said to the paralyzed man, stand up, pick up your mat, and go home. And he did. And they were all amazed and praised God, exclaiming, we have never seen anything like this before. Well, hang on just a few minutes and you will again. You'll see something like you've never heard before. Because as evening came, after a marathon of teaching and healing like this paralytic in the house, Jesus instructed his disciples to cross the Sea of Galilee by boat and retreat for a while and rest. He was tired. And they were in the boat, relaxing, enjoying the calm of the boat, when across the lake came a vicious storm. Suddenly, out of nowhere. It happens on the Sea of Galilee all the time. It's kind of like the rainy season here. Threatening to sink the boat. And the disciples were terrified. Where was Jesus? Well, Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. Apparently, he did not want to be awakened by a vicious storm or by the disciples. Either one. He is sound asleep. He's a lot like my wife. Pleasant person while she's awake. One of the most wonderful people in all the world while she's awake. I would not advise you ever waking her up. Not going to be a good outcome. And he's not just asleep, it's a sound sleep, snuggling with a pillow. Now realize, just because a storm in your life has caught you by surprise doesn't mean the Lord is surprised. Doesn't mean that's how the Lord reacts. It's not a shock to him. He's not panicked by anything. Jesus isn't suddenly up on the boat like the rest of the disciples, pacing and plotting and fretting and begging. He's asleep on a cushion. And so they woke him up, shouting, "Teacher, don't you care? We're going to drown." And when he woke up, the first thing he did is rebuke the wind and the waves. I don't know if you've ever tried that, but if you haven't, I would suggest you not. Suddenly, though, the wind stopped, and there was a great calm. You see, I want you to remember what he told them when this story begins. I don't know if you've ever thought about this story this way, but I want you to remember what he told them when this story began. He said, "Let's cross over to the other side of the lake." The Son of God, God incarnate, is in the boat and said, "Let's us cross over to the other side of the lake." Base your reactions to the storms in your life on his promises, not on your circumstances. Jesus had promised they would go over to the other side of the lake, not go under the lake. He had promised that. And they had such little faith. And he said they had such little faith. He said, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they were absolutely terrified even after the storm had stopped. I mean, who knew? Who knew that that little boat was the only ship in history that truly was unsinkable? Who knew that was the real Titanic? Because God had promised it would cross over. Sadly, the only thing that was sinkable that day was not the boat, it was the disciples' faith. I hope you can easily draw the parallel there. The only thing that is still sinkable today is not God's promises and God's will. It's eternal. It is our faith. Why are we so fearful? Or are we so faithless when we have Jesus in our boat? And when he has promised we'll cross over to the other side. In Mark chapter 10, Jesus encounters a young man who is, man, he's got it all going for him. He's young, he's religious, he's wealthy. He seems to be just a good guy. You know how we know all that? We do not know it from one text, we know it from a comparison of the Gospels. For instance, Mark, in verse 22 of this text, we'll go over there now. Mark says in verse 22 of this text that he's rich. He had a lot of possessions and a lot of money, and that was the one thing that was holding him back from following Jesus. But Matthew tells us he was young. Luke tells us he was a ruler, probably in the synagogue. So that's where we have always put it all together and called him the rich young ruler. We get three different clues from three of the different Gospels. He had wealth, he had health, he had power, but something was missing deep inside. And so Jesus told him, "Only God is good. Why do you call me good?" But to answer your question, you know what you must do to follow the Lord. You must not commit adultery. You must not steal. You must not testify falsely. You must not cheat anyone. Honor your father and your mother. And the young man replied, Teacher, I've obeyed all these commandments since I was young. And Jesus did not dispute him. And there were times where Jesus did dispute people, like the woman at the well that we'll see a little later. There were times when Jesus did dispute him. He didn't dispute him at all. Apparently, the young man was telling the truth. In fact, not only did he not dispute him, but he looked at him and felt genuine love for him and said, There's still one thing you haven't done. Go and sell all your possessions and give all the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And then come follow me. And at this, the man's face fell, and he went away sad, for he had many possessions. Now, Jesus didn't tell that to everybody. In fact, that's the only person he ever told that to. He didn't tell that to the 12 disciples that we read about earlier in the Bible today. He didn't tell them to go sell everything they had. Jesus, able to always look at our heart, knew this one thing was the thing that was going to hold this young man back. That was the one thing that would keep him from following him. So the obvious question for us is, what's your one thing? What do you love more than God, for sure? What potentially is the one thing that could keep you from fully obeying the Lord? That one thing we need to determine in our own life, because that's the one thing that can sink our faith and cause us to not follow the Lord. It's kind of like imagine a man proposing to his sweetheart by saying, Honey, I love you, and I really want to marry you, and I promise to take great care of you. I will love you all your life. I'll provide for you. I'll be a good husband. I'll be a good father to our children. All I ask is that you allow me a couple of days a year for other women. Is there anybody that would accept such an offer? Well, in today's world, probably. But nobody in here that would accept such an offer. So it's wrong for us to act as though Jesus will accept that kind of offer of discipleship. He won't. He says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and then all these other things will be added unto you. The next incident, that'll be the only time in the 4 weeks we discuss this in the Gospels, occurs in chapter 12, where some leaders sent some Pharisees and supporters of Herod. Now, you know, sometimes it's funny when we're reading the one-year Bible or something, or just reading a passage, we just fly through something that is very, very important, and I got a feeling most everybody in here has, like me, at some time or another, just flown right through this. We know about the trap set for Jesus, but we've flown right through this, and we shouldn't. That one line is very significant because both ends of the political spectrum are mentioned here. The Herodians, the supporters of Herod, were called Herodians, and they were a political party that always sided with King Herod. And they were Jews. They were Jews, Herodians, who always sided with the Roman representative of Governor Herod in their land. They were seen as Roman collaborators. In contrast, the Pharisees were the ultimate Jewish loyalists. And these two groups despised each other, as you might think. They were today's far left-wingers and far right-wingers, but their mutual hatred of Jesus created strange bedfellows among them. And so they came together to try to catch Jesus or trap him into saying something for which he could be arrested. They said, Teacher, we know how honest you are. You're impartial and don't play favorites. You teach the way of God truthfully. Now tell us, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now, this was just flattery, them talking about how honest he was and all that kind of stuff. They didn't honor Jesus. Like a piece of bread, they were just buttering him up before they were going to eat him. That's all they were doing. Because they tried really seriously to trap him here. It's a carefully crafted trick question. because if he says, pay taxes, they would accuse him of sympathizing with Rome. They might even call him an idolater. Since Rome viewed their emperor as a god, paying taxes to him could be tantamount to emperor worship. And they had thought this out and they knew that. But if Jesus said, don't pay the taxes, they could take him straight to the Romans right then for treason. And the Roman governor would have virtually no other option other than to punish Jesus. Either way, the Pharisees and the Herodians thought they had Jesus trapped. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Should we pay them or shouldn't we? And Jesus saw through their hypocrisy and said, why are you trying to trap me? Show me a Roman coin and I'll tell you. And when they handed it to him, he said, whose picture and title are stamped on it? Caesar's, they replied. Well then, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and give to God what belongs to God. And his reply completely amazed them. Now let me tell you why that's such an absolutely extraordinary answer by Jesus and what it means and sets up for us. On one side of the coin was the bust of Caesar with the words, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus. On the other side were the words Pontifex Maximus, which is Latin for high priest. So the coin was dedicated to the Roman emperor, and it literally was his property. I mean, seriously. In antiquity, coins were the property of the one whose image they bore. And so Jesus, obviously knowing that, said, if that coin then belongs to Caesar, give it back to him. But give to God what belongs to God. Well, what belongs to God? What bears, think about this, what bears God's image? He said, let me see the coin, took the coin, on it was the image of Caesar. Okay, well, Caesar's image is on here, and coins belong to the one whose image is on it, so give to Caesar what is Caesar's. So the obvious question then becomes, who bears the image of God? What bears the image of God? Genesis 1 tells us that we are created in the image of God. And so Jesus was not only brilliantly answering their question, he was telling us for all time a very important truth. Jesus is saying, look, Genesis says God made mankind in his own image and in his own likeness, and Jesus is saying, okay, give your coins then to Caesar, but give your life to God. You're talking about a marvelous answer. That's what that was. So I want you to think about just how brilliant that was and so many great applications it has, even for today. With amazing brevity and conciseness, Jesus affirms both the validity of human government, yet the limits of human government. He did both. God is supreme, but he ordained government, and government has a place. It can issue a tax if needed, but God expects our very lives. Utterly brilliant. Immediately after that, Jesus is confronted with the biggest and most important theological question of the day. One of the teachers of religious law was standing there listening to the debate and realized that Jesus had answered well on the debate about the coin, so they're going to try to ask him a second tough question. Of all the commandments, which is the most important? Now understand, that was the big theological discussion of the day. The scribes had broken down the law into 613 commandments. And they constantly argued about which ones were the most important, which were the least important, which was the greatest commandment of all, constantly discussing that. They had defined in their words, 248 positive injunctions or do's and 365 don'ts. In other words, literally, one don't for every day of the year. The question was, which of the 613 was more important than any of the others? And Jesus immediately responded to him, and he said, the most important commandment is this: listen, O Israel, the Lord our God is the one and only Lord, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength. And the second is equally important: love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. Now look, it was another brilliant answer, two in a row over the space of just a few minutes, because no Jew would have debated this answer. Jesus here is quoting from Deuteronomy 6:5. Every synagogue service began with that reading of a passage, with Deuteronomy 6:5. The most important commandment, then, Jesus said, is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love Him with all you've got, with all your heart, that is, make Him your supreme desire. Love Him with your soul, that is, make Him the object of your affections. Love Him with your mind, that means your brain, your thought processes should revolve around Him. Love Him with all your strength, that means with your pursuit and your passion and your work and your physical ability. And no Jew would debate that that was the greatest commandment. But what was so provocative is what He said next, because almost any Jew might debate what He said next. When He threw in the freebie, when He threw in the second greatest commandment, and the second is likened to it, without even being asked, and the second is likened to it, love your neighbor as yourself, He was quoting from Leviticus 19:18. And prior to this occasion, prior to Jesus saying this, no rabbi had ever connected loving God with loving your brother. That was new to them. That was a surprise to them. It elevated, what Jesus did there was He elevated and love your brother as yourself, not only the second greatest command and like the first one, but He elevated it as greater than all the other law. Now that didn't please the Pharisees either. Pleased His people maybe, but it didn't please Pharisees. That must have absolutely stung the consciousness of the listening Jews, who all claimed, like the rich young ruler did, to love God with all their heart and soul and mind and strength. But boy, they could be pretty void of love for their brother. And so Jesus really was teaching something new here. Really was teaching a brand new truth. He was teaching what John 13:34 and 35 says. Some have called it the 11th commandment, where Jesus said, a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this shall all men know you are my disciples, if you love one another. So He not only taught this in answer to the Pharisees and teachers' question, but later to His own disciples. Just before He was going to go to the cross, He spoke those words I just quoted. That was new. That was new teaching. It really was. Jesus is saying you don't have one without the other. Love for God and love for your brother go arm in arm. About 70 years later, John, the great apostle who was the closest to the Lord Jesus, wrote in his old age, if someone says I love God but hates a fellow believer, that person's a liar. For if we don't love people we can see, how can we love God whom we cannot see? Pretty good rhetorical question, isn't it? So back into Mark chapter 12, the teacher of religious law replied, well said, teacher. You have spoken the truth by saying there is one God and no other. And I know it is important to love him with all my heart and all my understanding and all my strength, and to love my neighbor as myself. This is more important to offer than all burnt offerings and sacrifices required in the law. And realizing how much the man understood, Jesus did something he only did 3 times in his ministry. That is at least recorded for us. He only did 3 times in his ministry. He said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And I love the next line. Now remember, all this is taking place at the same time. Caesar and the coin and the greatest commandments and all this is taking place at the same time. And I love what it says in the next line. After that, no one dared to ask him any more questions. Yeah, we're through with this. We're through with this line of attack. After this, we're just going to arrest him and crucify him before he crucifies us with his words, Really is kind of the truth. Jesus and his disciples then, in Mark 12, sat down near the collection box in the temple and watched as the crowds dropped in their money. Many rich people put in large amounts. Then a poor widow came and dropped in 2 coins. So I want you to understand that the best first century historian, by almost acclamation, Josephus, tells us that the temple had 13 trumpet-shaped offering boxes. And these 13 trumpet-shaped receptacles were narrow at the top and then got wider at the bottom to hold the coins that were placed in them. So it would be very easy to hear the rattling of the coins as they slid down the receptacles. And one could pretty well tell by the number of coins and the sound they were making how large or how small each gift was. And so the text tells us a poor widow dropped 2 small copper coins, which would have been worth only a fraction of a penny, into the receptacle. And yet, Jesus is going to compare her penny with the lavish offerings of the wealthy. He called his disciples to him and said, "I tell you the truth, this poor widow has given more than all the others who are making contributions. For they gave a tiny part of their surplus. But she, poor as she is, has given everything she had to live on." Which means this, if it means anything else. The size of an offering is not measured just by the amount that's given, but by the amount that's left. I love the old story about a rich man who was going to drop his offering in, but he decided to make a pompous show of it as the collection plates were being passed. That was way back in those decades ago when collection plates were passed. Remember that? And by the way, I hope you noticed, for anybody that was paying half attention, that the way we now are taking collection is the way the Jews took collection in the treasury, which is maybe a good thing. And not only that, but the way we take communion now, I think, is way better than we took it when we were passing. And maybe one person takes communion down here, and 10 minutes later, somebody in the back takes communion. And the way we take it now is we all take it at the same time, which I think is wonderful, which is what they did at the Last Supper. But those are just sidelines for the story. I love the story of the rich man who when they were passing plates, he wanted to make a pompous show of his offering. So he stood up in church and he told the crowd, "I want to be the first person to give a $20,000 anonymous contribution," as he dropped it into the plate. Oh, I've seen some of that in my years.